Now for the sponsor perspective portion of the program, which is produced by Biogen and Eisai. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Budd Haberlein, Vice President, Clinical Development at Biogen, and Johan Luttman, Vice President and Head of Clinical Development, Neurology Business Group at Eisai. Jill Lesser, Chief Strategy Officer at Us Against Alzheimer's Action, will be leading this next conversation. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you both for being here. As was just said, we have two distinguished scientists with us, and I'm excited to start this conversation. I think just picking up on what both Senator Tillis and Senator Markey said, they actually came at this issue from a couple of different perspectives. And the first that struck me was Senator Tillis's comment about the apparent or perceived simplicity of both care and treatment of Alzheimer's, but certainly the disease. And I think we're here to talk about the complexity and the way out of that complexity. And then Senator Markey talked about momentum. And I think those are two perfect words to begin this conversation as you all lead the Alzheimer's programs in your respective companies and have been doing this research in neuroscience and in translational research for such a long time. So glad to have you here. And I think this audience, as we talk about public policy, which is so important for us to figure out what are the right public policies in place, we need to really understand in a much more in-depth way where the science is and what our expectations are. So I'm going to ask you both about the state of the science. I'm going to start with you, Johan. Just share with us the latest research in your Alzheimer's disease and related disease portfolio at Eisai.
Thank you. First, before I answer your question, I'd like to go back. It's actually 111 years ago since the disease was described by Alois Alzheimer, a German, and Oskar Fischer, a Czech, and Salomon Faller, who was actually a Liberian-American scientist. So it's 111 years we have known about the disease. And Eisai actually been part of that journey for more than 30 years. We developed the first symptomatic treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, there we go. We developed the first symptomatic treatment for Alzheimer's disease, which was Aricept for cognitive deficits. But what those early pioneers described were actually the hallmark pathologies of the disease: amyloid plaques, extracellular amyloid plaques, and intracellular tangles. And we actually still work on those processes. We develop therapies against those pathologies, and we're actually in pretty late stage development with drugs against the amyloid pathology, and we're coming pretty soon thereafter with different therapies that address the tangle pathology. The disease also has some other characteristics, nerve cell loss, obviously, and inflammation. And we address those things as well in various programs, and we actually work with something we call immune dementia, really trying to understand the immunology behind the disease. And what is quite remarkable is that we can actually use something that I would argue is the best understood human biology, the immune system. And we actually use that to address the most complex organ in the body, the brain. And we actually use different immunological approaches like antibodies to go after those very hallmark pathologies I described, amyloid plaques and tangles. So we have, for example, antibodies that go after those pathologies and try to clear them out of the brain.
Fascinating. And so where are you in terms of Eisai's development?
We have, together, we have a big collaboration with Biogen. We have actually what we call late stage, which means that they're late development stage molecules that are of this very type, the antibodies. They are in what we call phase 3 studies and phase 2 studies. We'll come back maybe a little later to describe the effects we've seen, but they look very encouraging, the data we have. And that's why we're investing heavily in trying to develop those antibodies so they can really be fully validated. The data we have are very encouraging from smaller studies. And then the next generation we have are smaller molecules that also try to address the amyloid pathology, try to stop a little peptide called A-beta peptide that actually aggregates and forms those amyloid plaques that I talked about. We have inhibitors for the formation of those peptides, and that is also a program that we have in very late stage development in phase 3. And then we work with some antibodies also against the tangle pathology, the tau antibodies, like in early stage.
So we've been completely dispossessed of the notion that this is simple. But thank you for the very clear explanation.
As you say, it's an extremely complex disease. Yeah. And sometimes I call it a syndrome because it's a mix of cardiovascular factors, diabetes plays a big role. So this is not just one disease, and we have dominant mutations to very sort of dirty multifactorial causes. And what we do a lot is trying actually to identify the right patients. And we heard previously today about the different diagnostic tools we have, and we use them extensively in our trials. We try to find the right patients for the right drug.
Great. So Samantha, I'm going to turn this over to you to hear about where you are with in your leadership of Biogen's approach to Alzheimer's.
Thank you, Jill. And as Johan has mentioned, Biogen and Eisai are in a collaboration, and together we have a number of programs that are in the clinical testing phases for Alzheimer's disease. And principally, as Johan mentioned, those address the two key pathologies in Alzheimer's disease, and we refer to them loosely as amyloid and tau, but there's a lot of scientific terms that we could get into around that. And I'll speak to those programs and really what does that look like? What does a clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease look like? But we're not satisfied that those are the only approaches. It is a complex disease. We believe that there's a lot more biological mechanisms that are triggered by those core pathologies that we have known, as Johan mentioned, for more than 100 years. And so we continue to have research programs that continue to try and understand the nature of the disease, the mechanisms of disease, and potentially to bring forward more complementary therapeutics. But if we look at the program that we have together in the latest stages, a clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease for aducanumab, for example, is in more than 300 hospitals in more than 20 countries, and more than 3,000 patients are currently enrolled in that clinical trial. And we started that trial in 2015, and we have fully recruited, and so we know that the study will finish and read out in early 2020. So it's a 5-year undertaking, and that's the final step to really determine if this could be a potential therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease. And that final step takes place after more than 10 years of research and clinical trials prior to that. So this is a major undertaking to try and understand if such a molecule works. This particular mechanism, as Johan mentioned, monoclonal antibody, actually removes amyloid from the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And one of the key learnings that we have had in this field to try and reduce the complexity is what is the core pathology. And we do believe that amyloid is causative for Alzheimer's disease. We do believe the genetics, where these rare, unfortunate families have a mutation that causes buildup of amyloid, that is sufficient for those individuals to get Alzheimer's disease. So that's the core pathology that we're addressing with this program, and that we really hope will bring forward a treatment.
That's fantastic. We at Us Against Alzheimer's, as I think you know, do a pipeline report every year about all of the drugs in the pipeline. And we know that there have been so many failures over the last few years, and are so hopeful and excited by the momentum in this work. Drawing again back to what the senator said, it is so clear in the difficulty and expense of doing this research, of fully enrolling these trials, just how important the investment by the federal government is in Alzheimer's. So seeing the really exponential increases over the last 5 years has been pretty extraordinary. So talk to me a little bit about system preparedness, because one of the things that we know from other diseases, but certainly given the age and infirmity of the Alzheimer's population, as you look to the end of this trial, which is on the horizon, what do you see, and this is a question for both of you, as some of the opportunities and barriers in our system to getting that treatment ultimately to patients?
If I may start, I think the biggest challenge we have is the awareness and recognition of the disease. Even to get patients to our trials is a challenge, actually, and finding the right patients. So awareness, education, and de-demonizing the disease, I think, is very important. Then, of course, it's a very complex infrastructure, and Samantha talked about this quite a bit. You know, we are running global trials, meaning that we're all over the world. And care differs, cultures differ, what people like to do differ, what physicians like to do differ. So we have to deal with things like cerebrospinal fluid sampling. Someone called that spinal tapping. It doesn't sound good in English. And in the United States, it's a pretty big resistance to do that. In some countries, I come from Scandinavia, we do that all the time. We have no problem with it. And we have PET imaging, which is a very complex technology, quite expensive and requires a big infrastructure. And all that is needed really to find those patients that Samantha talked about. And they are the ones who will be the people that best benefit from our treatment. So we have to find those people through all those very complex infrastructures.
Absolutely. So we are, unfortunately, we could go on for a long time, just about out of time. But Samantha, I want to just give you a quick last word if you want to comment on the systems.
Thank you. Well, firstly, let me disavow you of the infirmity of the population. In clinical trials, our individuals are from age 50. And one of the biggest areas we will need for preparedness is the ability to accurately diagnose those patients using the molecular technologies that Johan mentioned, so the capacity of PET imaging and simply the number of trained neurologists and geriatricians to be able to identify these patients for treatment.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking both Samantha and Johan for joining us.